Hi everyone, this is Alan Rosinski of Metro Manhattan Office Space. Good afternoon. Today I'd like to comment on a recent Louis Rossmann video that discussed commercial real estate. The topic was a court ruling in Brussels, Belgium, which invalidated a lease, a retail lease. The case was essentially a landlord sued a store owner for non-payment of rent during the pandemic, and the court ruled that the tenant did not have to pay. In fact, the court released both parties from their lease obligations. The position that the court took was that the tenant, every time they paid monthly rent, was in fact paying for their ability to make a living. That there was almost an implied warranty by the landlord that the tenant was paying for the space's ability to generate revenue. In a time of lockdown, when there are no office workers, no foot traffic, that the tenant was not being provided with what they paid for. So the court released the tenant from this obligation. Now, I find this to be very typical of Europe, where governments tend to intervene in free markets in a heavier manner than they do in the United States. We live in a very laissez-faire society. But I don't particularly agree with this ruling. I think it's opening up a can of worms. First of all, a lease is a contract. It's a long-term contract. The prices are based on supply and demand. You'll pay X for a space because 4 or 5 other tenants would pay X for the space. And in order to acquire the space, you have to pay the market value. There's no warranty of what will happen. In the same way, let's say you sign a 10-year lease and your rent is $150 a square foot, and in 5 years it escalates to $180 a square foot. The landlord can't in 5 years start a litigation and say, hey, look, the economy's been doing very well. Prevailing rents have increased, and your space is now worth $350 a square foot. You either start paying the $350 or vacate your space. It's just not how it works. A lease is a contract, and you're bound by the terms and conditions of the contract. You may find yourself, you may have, let's say, a flower shop on 6th Avenue. 5 years ago, you signed a lease for $100. And now, because of the development of commercial condominiums and increased traffic, that space is worth $200. Landlord can't get you out, and it works the other way. If there's some black swan event, a dip in the economy, a pandemic, you can't have the lease invalidated because some unknown black swan event occurred. At the same time, you have a lot of sympathy for tenants. And markets are very, very efficient because markets will protect tenants now. I don't know of many landlords who are rushing to evict tenants now in New York City, because they evict a tenant, they're going to have a vacancy. And the vacancy is going to cost them more than adjusting the rent or giving them terms or giving them an abatement for several months and allowing the tenant to pay the abatement over the long term. Because if they don't do that, their tenants will go under and they'll be left with vacancies. So having the legal system intervene is about the most inefficient thing you can do. And what happens in a situation where there's no lockdown, a store is open, and their sales are down 50%? Do you have the courts determining what a space is available? Can you imagine the fiasco, the mess, the litigation, and how long that would take? Totally inefficient. It makes more sense to have the market determine conditions. And you start off from the point that a lease is a legal obligation, but landlords are going to have an incentive to keep their tenants, and whether they're moral or not moral, keeping the tenants is going to work out to them doing the right thing in terms of adjusting the rents. That's the position that I would take. And now let's start to look at this a bit differently. What if you started off with the premise that it would be okay for the courts to invalidate a lease during a lockdown? You've got to keep in mind that many of these landlords are small businesses. You even have some buildings owned by somebody who owns a couple of medallion taxis, works 16 hours a day, he's got a heavy mortgage. And because some court invalidates a lease in one of his buildings, he can't pay the mortgage. So you have, in fact, you're damaging another small business, even if the original tenant has been released from their lease. And then if the mortgage can't get paid, the bank is damaged. And if the bank has securitized a loan, and that loan has been sold and has been purchased along with many others by a pension fund, that pension fund is damaged. So having leases invalidated really isn't the right way to go. And now, of course, what's occurred with the pandemic is a tragedy. I mean, I'm totally in favor of some form of government aid under the circumstances. Maybe moving forward, when this is done, there'll be some form of a national insurance company, or insurers will take potential black swan events into account, and there'll be mandatory insurance. There'll certainly be provisions made for these sorts of incidents in the future. In any event, I understand Lewis, he's looking from the perspective of a business owner in New York City, and it's very, very difficult for anybody operating a retail business. If you found this content interesting or helpful, I'd be happy if you subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can always find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @MetroManhattan. Until the next time.